Let's turn to the literary scene now. Here in Berlin, the annual African Book Festival has kicked off. The theme this year is Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow, exploring the connections between the continent's older and younger writers. This comes at a time of growing international recognition for African authors.
The 2021 Nobel Prize for Tanzanian novelist Abdulrazak Gurnah capped a year in which nearly every big book award, from the Booker to France's Prix Goncourt, went to writers from Africa.
I think the reason these prizes have been awarded to these texts and these materials is because of the quality of the writing. And that's why I'm saying it's a coincidence. It's not to say, the world is waking up now and it's giving. It's because this writing is good.
At Cameroon's largest bookstore, African literature packs the shelves. Owner and literary scholar Ambroise Combe thinks European readers are fascinated by how African literature differs from the Western tradition.
Ça peut consister au sujet.
It's a combination of the subject matter, which deals with the situations in Africa, and a fascination with the literary style, with narrative forms that are not fundamentally Western.
De narrer qui n'est pas essentiellement occidental.
To ensure African literature has a bright future, Kenyan-based writer and publisher Zukiswa Vana says we need to focus on the next generation of African storytellers.
I owe it to myself to be able to hold on and bring younger generation of writers and give them voice and give them the platforms. A lot of African countries are only like 50, 60 years from colonialism. We're still growing. We are still young.
So we've seen the growing profiles of African writers. But what do reading habits on the continent look like? We've been finding out.
I read entrepreneurial books, I read inspirational books, I read motivational books.
Yeah, personally, I don't like reading books. The reason behind that is because I really spend more time in online, maybe YouTube, doing some research.
I read novels, mostly romantic. Mostly I read at the library or at home. It can be anywhere.
I guess I don't always make time to read because I always busy with singing because I always find myself with music, and that's why I don't usually read books.
I don't think I can even tell you one African writer, so I think there's more accessibility to international books. That's why normally you would lean towards them because there's a lot of them.
Reading books is like going to different authors, understanding their experiences, learning from their wealth of imagination and thoughts. So reading opens up my imagination. It brings me to another world. It gives me insight.
Joining me here in studio are two distinguished authors from the continent, from South Africa, Niq Mhlongo, a Soweto-born writer. His latest book is a collection of short stories published in May titled For You I'd Steal a Goat. And Jennifer Makumbi from Uganda. Her second novel, The First Woman, won last year's Jalak Prize. Both my guests are multi-award-winning writers. Welcome to DW News Africa. We've just heard mixed views from the continent about people's reading habits. As writers, Jennifer, let me start with you. Are you concerned that you have to compete with technology to grab people's attention?
Not concerned, because that is always there. There's always the media you compete with as a novelist. But what I have to do is to convince a few readers in Africa that what I'm doing is interesting and that it is worth spending time with. Because in Africa, novels travel by word of mouth. So once you convince a few people, those will tell, imagine one person tells 10 people about your book. That is, 10 people have read it, that's 100 people, that's 1,000 people. So for me, competing with technology or with Western writers is not a major problem.
And Niq, what stories need to be told and read on the continent?
I think, I feel like, personally, when I write a story that, people can relate to. But firstly, are the stories that I would love to read if I was somebody out there who was not, who was not a writer. What stories would I like to read? So I write such kind of stories. So these are the stories. Stories will always be different from one person to another, And the more the diversity of stories, the more, important it is for people to have that kind of diversity. So I think what stories to write? Let's just write stories, and people will read.
Yeah. And speaking of reading, were either of you or both of you avid readers as children?
Oh, yeah. You can't write if you're not an avid reader. I used to read like mad. I mean, I'm one of those who used to hide away at home, or sometimes, a grown-up would come and say, "Are you going to eat books for dinner today?" That kind of reader.
Niq?
Yeah, I grew up reading, but mostly I grew up reading African writers' series. I think we talked about it. Yeah. Because I found it difficult in South Africa, for instance, the books that were accessible to us were books that were prescribed in schools, like your Shakespeare, So those were difficult for me. I couldn't relate to many of them, Even the English was modern English for me. So where I found that, I could relate, books that I found that I could relate are books that were written by African writers talking about things that I also know, in the African Writers series. Yeah.
Right, and on that note, let's pause the conversation for now and go to Ghana, where we meet a woman whose passion and love is in African writing, and she's actively trying to get children to fall in love with books and reading.
So God sent a deep.
Isabel Nyako loves reading. The 7-year-old is one of several children taking reading lessons at this literacy center in Ghana's capital, Accra.
I like reading books because I get to discover new words.
The lessons are run by teacher and writer Edem Tokono. She began reading at a young age because her parents could afford to buy books. She has since set up this organization called Booksy to pass on her passion to children.
Dad says he used some of his old tires.
We group children by reading level, and then depending on what reading level the child is, they have a different activity. So if they are now learning how to read, then they're doing phonics, they're doing story time where we'll share like a book of the day with them, but they are also doing phonics. So they've got a sound of the week, and we do activities around that sound.
The books Edem uses here are special. Each one is written by an African author. That's because she didn't have access to many when she was growing up, and she wants to change that.
I think that it's really important for children to be surrounded by content where the characters, the heroes in it, look like them. It helps boost your confidence. When it comes to reading, it helps you even understand more because the material is relatable, and it gets you excited to pick up these books.
Edem also runs an online bookshop, so readers from across the country can access children's books written by a variety of African writers. But she has her work cut out. 80% of children in sub-Saharan Africa can't read or understand a simple story by the age of 10, according to the World Bank. Edem and her team are doing what they can to encourage more kids in Ghana to pick up a book. And it's already making a difference. Isabel is fast becoming one of the best readers in this group as her confidence continues to grow.
You today. Granny smiled and said, "Please do make me one." That's so kind.
Jennifer Makumbi and Niq Mhlongo are still here with me, authors from the continent. Jennifer, is it important, or how important is it for you to be read on the continent, to be read back home, and how does that influence your writing?
Oh, for me, I write specifically for African readers. Most writers write for everyone out there, or write for a Western audience, but I write for first Ugandan reader and everybody else on the continent. And that has made all the difference because I'm published by the West, but I'm writing for different people. So there's a conflict there. But I've finally been accepted in that way. And there's a lot of appreciation in Uganda and in Africa because of the way I write. Because when you focus on African writers, the language changes, the subject matter changes, the tone, the attitude, the whole text changes because the way we speak to each other is so different, and you take that into the text.
Niq, just picking up on what she said, as an African, you're writing a story, but most of the time, publishers are from outside Africa. How much, they're a platform, but they can also be a bit of a challenge for you to be able to tell your story authentically.
Yes, I think fortunately or unfortunately, I haven't been published in a sense outside. So my publisher is mostly in South Africa, who understand the context in which I'm writing. But my stories, of course, they get to be translated into different languages, of which I don't have access of those languages of how they've translated them. But in essence, I think what I write, I believe that my writing, for instance, helps to bridge that gap that is there between South Africa, Africa, and the rest of the world, in a sense that people can be able to get the nuances of what it means to be a South African from my text, So I would say, just like Jennifer, for instance, firstly, I write for myself, then I write for Africa, my people around South Africa, but I write also for the world, for people to understand, and through my books, hopefully, people will be able to know what kind of a country one comes from, and then also help to, to make life easier.
And very quickly, both of you have written short stories. What's the significance of these for you? Jennifer?
I first started out writing short story for the wrong reasons. That was because I was working on a very large book, and sometimes when you're working on a big book, you get lost along the way in terms of the plot. So my mentor told me, "Can you write short stories because they are fast." And the narrative arc is, you can't waffle about. So I started doing that, but then I fell in love with them and kept writing quite a few until I published a collection of short stories. But always, I know, when I get an idea for a short story, I know that this is going to be a short story. And when I get an idea for a novel, I know that this is going to be a novel.
Niq, very quickly, your thoughts as well?
I think almost the same thing. When you write short stories, you know that you want the theme that you want people to know. Like, for instance, you want to write about gender-based violence. People won't mistake it for something else because you are focused on that particular theme. In novels, it's easy for you to say, okay, I want to write about this particular theme, and people pick another theme. But that doesn't happen when it comes to short stories. And also, short stories, when you write them, they easily access. These are the stories that even people that are not necessarily readers become readers,
Super.
Yeah, they're short bites, aren't they?
Yeah. Super. Jennifer Makumbi and Niq Mhlongo, thank you very much for coming into studio. And that is where we'll leave it for today. I hope the conversation has sparked something in you to keep reading or to start if you haven't already. Until next time, bye for now.